Welcome to the Bar and Benches discussion, basically on the recent petition that these 9 women lawyers have filed in the Supreme Court against Madhya Pradesh High Court bail order, not challenging the bail per se, but certain remarks made by the judge, whereby it was stated that the accused needs to visit the house of the victim and get a rakhi tied by the victim, pay some money, which is a ritual custom which is paid during Rakhi to the victim, and that is how a settlement was sought to be arrived in the particular case. Interestingly, the petition before the Supreme Court says that offense as heinous as sexual assault is often trivialized by the court by giving such short-term solutions. The lead petitioner in this case is Advocate Aparna Bhatt, a Supreme Court lawyer, and there are 8 other women lawyers and independent professionals whom we have today with us. I'll quickly take you through who these 9 women lawyers are. Firstly, Advocate Bhatt has been practicing in the Supreme Court since 1992, and between 2005 and 2011, it was Advocate Bhatt's initiative that the Delhi government had appointed her office to operate a rape crisis, a 24-hour multidisciplinary support service, including helpline for rape survivors in Delhi. She was also an amicus curiae in the Muzaffarpur shelter home case, which we are all aware of how it panned out in the court. Petition number 2, Ms. G.S. Veena, has been a professor of law for more than 25 years. She has taken active part in various student counseling initiatives as well as anti-ragging committee and the sexual harassment committee. Thank you for being with us, Advocate Veena.
Thank you, sir.
We have with us Advocate Kanaklata Olawat. She's a lawyer and she has been working globally for many years. She's currently a senior director, Asia Pacific, for global immigration law firm based in Singapore and consults on corporate immigration for Fortune 50 clients. Thank you so much for being with us, Advocate Olawat, and I hope you've reached Dubai safely.
Yes, I have. Thanks.
So now we come to the next petitioner we have with us, Advocate Susan Beretta de Silva. She's a lawyer and a senior member of the Human Resources community. She is presently serving as the Vice President HR at a cybersecurity company. She heads the Internal Complaints Committee in her company. I'm sure we'll have a lot to listen to you from Advocate Silva, especially how you handle such issues and complaints when it comes to the Internal Complaints Committee in organizations such as yours. Ms. Lakshmi NB is an advocate practicing in the Karnataka High Court since 1992. She was the first one to join us on the Zoom call today. Interestingly, she has a wide range of practice and has taken up a lot of cases pertaining to women's rights and sexual assault cases in the Karnataka High Court. Thank you so much for being with us, Advocate Lakshmi. Next, we have Advocate Lalita Sivaraman Iyer. She's a lawyer by training and practiced in the Karnataka High Court for many years. She then moved to a different field and works as an editor in quality control for the medical transcription industry. She's also an animal welfare activist. Thank you so much for being with us, ma'am. Next, we come to Advocate Ramachandra Iyer. She's a practicing advocate and has handled a variety of cases. She has a flourishing practice in the corporate side and also represented many women in various courts. She has a PhD in corporate law and she takes many courses, advises on gender issues and handles matters related to women's rights. It will be very interesting to get your insights today, ma'am. The last petitioner whom we have with us is Ms. Meenakshi Casey. She's a lawyer by training and has practiced in the Karnataka High Court. Thank you so much for being with us, ma'am. Ms. Sushmita Durg is not with us. She's also one of the petitioners in the case today. She's a lawyer and she has practiced in the Karnataka High Court for a period of 92 to 93, following which she changed her field and joined an IT company and presently works as the documentation team lead in our organization. She's also one of the petitioners. Though she's not with us today, I'm sure the other petitioners would be more than willing to answer a few questions on her behalf too. Before we start with questions and how this case came up to the Supreme Court, one of the basic fundamental questions today is, why did you all think to file this case in the Supreme Court? Why challenge these particular remarks of the judge in the top court. If I could ask Advocate Bhatt to start the session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Divine. It's a pleasure to be here, and also between amongst all the petitioners. Why we chose to do this petition is I'll speak for myself. You see, if you remember, a remark by the Karnataka High Court, at which time we were all very agitated. And then being from Karnataka, we felt even more so, because we felt it somebody in our house is doing it, that's why. So anyway, at that time, I decided to write a letter, and the letter was written, you published it, couple of other journals published it. And this is the group actually with whom I had discussed at the time I filed the petition. And then filed that letter, and following their inputs, when this happened, when this happened, I took it to them, and I said, we can't keep writing letters every time. And also we can't only have these social media discussions. It's high time we did something more than that. And so that was my idea. And then I took it to all of them, and they supported me in a way that I couldn't even believe it. And I'm sure you'll hear from them directly about why they chose it. And we just felt that it is, we can't just be a kind of a silent observers to these kind of issues. And wherever we can, obviously we can't take up all issues. There's so many of them. We can't take up all of them. But wherever we can, we must raise our voice and take whatever action that is feasible to us in our professional and personal capacity. And that is why we are here. I'm sure others would like to add a few things.
If I could hear Meenakshi, KC ma'am, to shed some light on why did you decide to particularly join this petition and challenge these remarks in the Supreme Court? I think you need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Divine. Yeah. So during the introduction, you clearly said that I work for an organization that takes care of IC, and I have been working with this team for some time now, and a couple of years of experience in this field and the area of sexual harassment or any of the related harassment, activities and tasks. Considering all of that, I looked at this and I realized this is a very, how the judgment has been gone into, and it has been, taken, at least looking at it, it's a lot disagreeable, considering that it has been made to look as if it's very trivial, the whole issue. And since I work a lot with a lot of young women who come and speak about their, instances. It could be something very, small little activities and things like that. And it bothers them so much. It traumatizes girls quite a bit, sometimes for a lifetime. And these are things that we have to be cognizant of when we take care of issues that as such. So when Aparna brought this up, I thought I would also, join in the league, because it is something that that we're fighting for a cause, right? And something that we need to look at in a positive way.
If I could ask, thank you so much, Meenakshi ma'am. If I could ask Ms. Rama Iyer, this question. What are the ordeals of a victim of sexual harassment faces in India at various stages of legal procedure? Is this the reason why often such settlements are seen as an easy way out? I particularly ask this question and pose this question to you also because you have practiced in the Karnataka High Court for a long period of time and dealt with such similar cases. So what is your take on this? Like, why do you think such ordeals are being faced by sexual harassment victims?
Thank you. Thank you for having us in this program. Well, insofar as women who are victimized are concerned, those who are victims of sexual harassment, for them to first go to the police station or initiate legal action itself is after they have to cross many barriers before they can do that. So once they cross that barrier, they have to face a lot of stigma within their own families and society and community. So what happens is they undergo a lot of trouble before they actually approach the court. Then they have to go through the medical examination if required, and then the court process of trial. And what happens is the woman relives her trauma each day, and every time she has to explain and then justify why she went to the court or to take legal course, to take recourse through legal action. So that becomes quite an ordeal. And so when an opportunity is given in terms of settlement, which should never be done, because these are all crimes against the state, and it is not something that can be compounded or compromised, can never be thought of as an option. But when it is given, maybe that is one of the reasons why some of the survivors, they take it up. And also the prolonged trial where she is subjected to a lot of questions and fingers are pointed at her. So that becomes a very difficult thing for her. Probably that is one of the reasons why they accept, though I think that there should be no compromise whatsoever in any case of sexual assault.
I think there's also a factor that plays out here is the area and the background the victim belongs to, because there is a large amount of difference in the way they perceive such sexual assault cases to be if they're from the urban areas, wherein they have access to lawyers, access to a set of parents who would be willing to take the case to the higher judiciary if need be. And when it's a rural area, probably, they look for an easy settlement because there's this concept of prestige and respect in the society that plays a large role. Do you think that kind of a difference comes to play here when such settlements are proposed by the high courts, or is it an en masse thing that happens?
Well, we do see that the background of the survivor or the prosecutrix definitely matters. Because many a times we see that when it is a kind of financial settlement that is offered, there are some people who do accept it. So, though I have not seen any sort of compromise in such cases in my practice, but I do think that that is one of the reasons that, of course, access to higher courts to challenge that also is definitely a factor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Advocate Olawat, my questions to you. Do you think the lack of women judges in India is a part of the problem?
Well, not really. I don't think that would be the problem, but it's the awareness of the victims themselves of what it is that they can do coming out and, talking for themselves or making that noise or making it known to the world that they have been, they've undergone this kind of a treatment or been harassed. So I think that is what it's, the awareness. And then, they get to hear that even if you went if you spoke out, there is a long drawn process. They may have to go to police station. They may not be heard there. So these are the kind of challenges that the victims themselves go through and battle in their mind and then make a decision of should we do this or not or suppress it. So I don't necessarily think it is the lack of, women lawyers or who can talk on their behalf. But it is definitely their own, lack of confidence that they may be able to get what they want in terms of judgment in their favor, right? I think that's what it is. I'm sure, my other friends here may have to add to this one.
Advocate Veena, it is often said that judgments and orders stem from the mindset of a judge. In this case, how how does one judge expunge or censure the other? The question is, does it tantamount to interfering with judicial conscience, or does it have to be in sync with moral standards?
I think the judgment should be in consonance with the moral order. See, law itself is a common sense, we say. Any common man can easily read the order and he can come to a conclusion. The interpretation part is different. Legally, your interpreting is different. But who hears this? The general public hears it. See, when it was published in a newspaper the other day, in Deccan Herald, today I was having an online session class because I am teaching from past 25 years. So I was teaching in the class. At the end of the session, one of the students said, ma'am, I have a doubt in CRPC. I said, what in CRPC? I was teaching labor law. I said, why CRPC now in between? Then, ma'am, we read one article yesterday's paper, Deccan Herald, and they didn't know that I was a petitioner, and I didn't tell them also. But they asked, ma'am, how far is it right? Whether if we accept this condition, tomorrow I pull a hand of my classmate and I come to you because you sit on the sexual harassment committee. I come before, if she comes before you, and I say, anyhow, she let her tie Rakhi and I will just walk off. Right. Is it acceptable? Is it morally acceptable? Legally acceptable? See, orders must be legally acceptable. It should be based on criminal jurisprudence, rule of law. Now, if it doesn't sink in with social standards, what is law for? Law is made for society. Ultimately, the law is for us. We have made the law. We to ourselves, to govern ourselves. And if it doesn't cater to the need of the society, that order will be of no use. And it gives a wrong message to the society and to the younger generation. Especially now with the technology, with the click of the button, they can tell us the case loss in the classroom. They say, ma'am, what is this? So it becomes difficult for us to even to convince them that we cannot tell that is the judgment is wrong. We cannot tell because it has come from a higher courts. So it becomes difficult. So it should be morally and socially acceptable one. And it should be based on rule of law and criminal jurisprudence. That is what my opinion is.
Okay. Advocate De Silva, my question is to you. How does such complaints pan out in offices, especially, since you have been a part of the corporate structure? Here in this case, the victim was not from a well-off background. But when such similar instances crop up in the corporate sector, how is it usually dealt with? Do you think the kind of flashes we see of judicial conscience in such orders, does it also work out in the corporate settings? Are such easy short-term solutions also proposed in offices?
So let me allow my colleague Meenakshi to take this question. She has dealt with far more cases than I have, and I think she's more better off answering this one. Meenakshi, over to you.
Thanks, Susan. So, Devan, just to let you know that kind of complaints, these kind of complaints with regard to harassment do come up in organizations, right? Most companies these days have an internal committee, an IC, which take up such issues, right? Most companies these days have constant communications with their team members, with the organization at large. They take care of the awareness and education of these laws and insist on the prevention and prohibitions also of these kind of harassments, right? Sexual harassments. Then companies encourage complaints to be brought in through various different platforms, which is best suited for the complainant to raise it. So they need to have a proper platform to bring it up, because it's not something which is very comfortable to speak or, to bring it out in open. So these platforms also assures every team member in the organization a confidentiality and safety requirements of themselves, right? So when the companies at large have such platforms, you would definitely ensure and coax team members, when you have an open culture, for them to come up. And of course, a trained IC team in a company which works for the right outcomes on these kind of issues usually brings out the best standard working processes, and based on that they do come out with good outcomes and submits their recommendation to the management and for their decisions taking, right? But in this case, when I look at it, when we bring and have cases such as these, right, it brings in a lot of challenges to the IC team completely in the organizations right now. Because basically what is it saying? Primarily, it alters the basic belief and understanding, of that a molestation or a offense, like as such, is basically a criminal offense and cannot be corrected just by a small factor of an apology. So right. That's where I see this very strong in our kind of organization.
The way they deal with it as compared to the courts.
Yeah. So it's a quasi kind of a atmosphere, right? I mean, that's the right the IC today has, the quasi legal rights in the organization to run it as a, for team members to take it in.
Right. Thank you so much. Advocate Lalita, my question is for you. When we speak about this particular thing, where do the assumptions that women will forgive and that, imposing a sibling-like relationship between the perpetrator and the victim will ensure that abuse comes to an end germinate, right? What can be done to put this notion to an end? Because, you all have challenged the Madhya Pradesh High Court observation, but there has been innumerable cases across India when such solutions have been proposed by high courts, district courts, when they have been handling such cases. So how do you think, this notion can come to an end? Today, I'm just taking it hypothetically, the case reaches the Supreme Court and there's suppose the job court takes notice of it and suppose expunges the remark. Do you think, that will have an impact on hundreds of other judges across India who have been passing such proposed settlements in such cases?
Yeah, Divine, I hope it does. I really sincerely hope it does, because that's what we are trying to do. Because I think this ultimately it amounts to trivialization, right? So the trauma that a victim is going through, the courage that she has gathered to approach law enforcement, to come to court, that is being kind of thrown out the window, because she's asked to, it's like she's asked to be mollified by a custom like this, okay, this is a brotherly relationship, and you're going to be now forget what happened. Now he's going to you're going to tie a rakhi to him, you're going to take money gift from him, and he's going to promise to protect you forever and ever. Okay, so it is an insult to the victim who has taken the trouble. First of all, she has gone through the trauma of the actual molestation. Okay. And I mean, if I put myself in her place, I would, I feel pretty insulted about it. I mean, I would feel this thing that, and this is something I want to bring, forth, that as a woman in India, at least our generation, when I was growing up, we have all faced, some form of molestation or the other. It may be trivial. I mean, it may be small, but to a major thing. But simple things like, you're going in the bus, going to college, going to bus, you get, leaned over on you, or, someone touches you, someone gropes you. It has happened many times. I mean, you walk on the road, someone comes on a bike and, deems it fit to hit your butt and go. Okay. So, and this happens. And then you, I mean, obviously you are angry and frustrated, and then you go and you talk to your, I mean, who's the person you talk to first? You probably your family. And somehow it has been in India, I don't know, the society that we are kind of exposed to, that, it is not given much importance. It is, you're always asked to, okay, it happens, everyone, it happens. Yeah, you just be careful next time. Don't go on that road. Or, don't take that bus. Okay. And literally they suppress you. You're not encouraged to take action about it. Okay. At the most, you may take your own action. You may, confront the person and slap, or, I mean, anything that you may take, or you may, I mean, sometimes all you can do is just vent out, with some expletives, but nothing more you can do. And I mean, it has happened to me. I come home and then, I tell them, and it's like, it's okay. Yeah. I mean, let's not make a big deal of it. Okay. So this kind of so what I'm thinking is, you go through all these things, you go to court and you come, before the thing, and then you face this thing, because this particular instance, it really irks me, because Rakhi, tying a Rakhi, first of all, it is a very sacred bond. And here you are asking a woman to, get a Rakhi tied. I mean, first of all, the crime is alleged to have been occurred inside her home. And then, with the sanction of the court, this guy comes home and then ties the Rakhi. Okay, and then she accepts money, which I feel is an insult. And then what happens to her trauma? What I mean, you're inviting your molester home, and tomorrow, anything can happen, and so I absolutely am against this. What I'd like to call, in my own thing, as panchayat nyaya, so where, in a village those days, people would sit under a tree, and, the elders of the village would be there, and they would come, and, instead of going to court, this would happen. And, some compromises this thing out there. So somehow I feel that, we are going to a high court, and where, all the rules of law are laid down, and to have to think to this is and is completely unnecessary. And I hope that the Supreme Court, takes cognizance of this. I hope that some sort of some sort of instructions are given, or do's and don'ts are given, saying that don't pass remarks that are totally unnecessary to the case.
Yeah.
Okay, like it happened in the Karnataka High Court case. So don't pass it. There's no need. I mean, there's no need to bring an extraneous thing into this. Okay, it is not like somebody has suggested tying a rakhi here, right? It is come from the judge's own background, or we don't know what it is, like, but he feels like, oh, this is the best way to deal with this. And maybe it's like from the movies, in the olden days, the movies that we see, Bollywood movies, this is the kind of thing that happens. But I think in real life, it is a joke. It should really not be done.
Right. Very well taken. Advocate De Silva, one question for you I was meaning to ask. How far do you think is importance of gender sensitization programs among judges in the higher judiciary? And, if at all that is needed, what do you think should those programs entail? Do you think that could be a plausible solution to this, the problem that is here?
Yeah, actually, that's about, probably the most perfect thing that we can do in this. So by and large, we are so accustomed to thinking of people in genders and assigning them gender-specific roles and so on. So if you see, some part of what Lalita answered, right, about tying the rakhi, so it's the onus comes on the woman. That's a gender-specific thing. And having to forgive the man, that again becomes the woman's part of it. She needs to go and be more forgiving and so on, right? So I feel, there are so many ways that we can bring in gender neutrality right now. And that's where the world is going, actually. I mean, everyone's moving towards gender neutrality. And at times I feel, here we are regressing. We're going backwards in this rather than moving forwards. So if you look at gender neutrality, there is so much that one can do. First of all, I think, empathy holds a huge part in this. Empathy is probably the key in what we do. And that's something that I'm sure the judiciary is very cognizant of. But sometimes, sitting up in that chair away from the masses, probably that does get diluted a little bit. And empathy is probably the bottom line in educating people, in making them understand that what it feels like to be on the other side, why something becomes wrong just because, you're assigning a gender to it, or you're assigning a role to that particular person. So that, in my opinion, is probably something that we need to do. And these are the areas, and I don't think there are specific training programs that the judiciary needs to go through, or people in specific need to go through. It just requires us to open our minds. More or less, people like you and me and everybody else on this call going out and speaking to people and telling people that, hey, you don't have to say boys will be boys. Boys can behave in any which way, and girls can behave in any which way. And, you don't have to say girls should do this and boys should do this. And that's when, we will be able to bring people to a point where you can appreciate somebody else's point of view. That's when there will be justice for people who seek for it.
Right. Advocate Lakshmi, you have been practicing in the Karnataka High Court for the past 30 years, approximately, and you've been dealt with so many women-related cases. There was a similar case in the Karnataka High Court as well, wherein letters were written to the Supreme Court to expunge remarks made against the sexual assault victim. My question to you is, how many such petitions would be needed to end this problem? Like, how do you see this panning out? Does a petition have to be filed every time calling into question every such order, or do you see there is a long-term solution here, especially since you've spent a considerable number of years at the High Court?
Thank you, Divine. No, what I would like to say is that there are a backlog in our courts. A number of cases has been still pending, and it is not, and no cases is given immediate relief.
Okay.
So what people say, like fast track courts should be there to solve such cases where this victims gets the immediate relief, because this relief is given in long terms, where the person involved would have lost the interest in moving from one corner to the other. So that is what I say, like even when there was an amendment in CRPC in 1993, in section 327 of CRPC, that in-camera inquiry was that the victim is not comfortable at all. She's not comfortable. She still says, no, I'm not comfortable in-camera proceedings. She does not come out with her own, like what trauma she has undergone. So immediate relief has to be given, and there is a lot of cases pending. And as I heard, 20,000 cases were pending in 1983. 2003, hardly 69 petitions were sought.
Okay.
20,000 cases. That is what happens. Like,
so you see that as one of the reasons why. Okay.
People don't approach. They say like it's a long term. No short-term relief is given. Immediate relief is given to the victim.
Right. Advocate Olawat, you have a considerable experience outside in Indian courts. When there are such matters arising out of India, have you ever heard of or encountered such situations where such settlements or proposal to settle out such disputes have been given, or it's actually looked down upon?
Well, I don't think this is a matter restricted to India. Globally, there is harassment. There is, I think about what I read is about 2 billion women below the age of 18 years and, above the age of 18 years and over are sexually harassed. They go through some type of sexual harassment or the other. Now, maybe the case proceedings may not take that longer, like what we have in our country. They could be fast track cases, but again, the common factor here is that there are very few people who come out and think that they need to take this forward. So that is definitely the common link that we are seeing globally. Now, woman has this thought basically in the mind that, the responsibility or the task of proving that they've gone through this lies on the woman. And then again, generally women by and large, they think there is very little consequence for men in these kind of situations than women. So women faces it all, even if they come out, right? They are the ones who are standing there and have the responsibility to prove one against many others. So that way they are taking a back step, or they're not taking that forward step. And this is a global, the pattern that we've seen. And again, in corporates, like I work with corporates, Fortune 50. Now in corporates, when you have some kind of sexual harassment, it could be in line, right? If you have a subordinate who's gone through it from a senior, the subordinate is thinking twice, hey, what if I take this? The senior has more power there. Will I be heard, right? And then even if I'm heard, will I lose my job? Because I've done this, I may be negligible in my work. So maybe I'm the first thing or first action that could be taken would be me losing my job. My promotions may be stopped. So there are all of these kind of, social trauma that they go through that may not necessarily give them the courage to go forward. And this is not just in South Asian countries, that this is in Western countries as well. I've seen it. I've heard from my colleagues. I've heard quite a lot of different forums that I've attended on women, health and women empowerment. This is a common platform. This is a common topic that comes up in each of these platforms. So it's not restricted to only India. And, we do whenever possible, like what Meenakshi said and what Susan said from corporate sector, we do whenever it comes to us. We are sitting and, or counseling them saying, hey, you need to take a stance on this. We are here to support you. But how many people have that kind of a support? How many women have that support? And in India, of course, the kind of judgment that we saw, have they asked the woman, is that what she wants? Right? Has she agreed? Or is she forced to agree to that kind of a judgment? Right? It could be a force. I don't think she very consciously has said, hey, that's fine. I'm going to treat him as my brother. I don't think so. It could be a family talking to her, counseling. Maybe the police are counseling her. Maybe the legal is counseling her to say yes to it and close this matter, right? Before it is dragged on. Now, these kind of instances happen everywhere, every day globally. And that's where we need to take the stance. That's exactly what we all have gathered here. We said it's not going to be a living room topic anymore. We need the higher courts to listen to us. We need them to see what is happening around and why. That's basically the step that we are taking.
Right.
And it's all around.
Taking a cue from what Advocate Olawat says, Advocate Bhatt, do you think, very correctly, the point that she raised was the victim is often not asked whether, she agrees to such a settlement. How far do you think, this situation pans out in the Indian courts, whether it be the High Court or the Supreme Court? Is the victim usually taken into account when such settlements or, proposals are given, or it's usually just a dictation of order by the court?
Thanks, Devan. I want to clarify here. This is not the case where a question of settlement was being talked about. Okay, I mean, talking about this specific case, it was when the person applied for bail.
Right.
Means the investigation is not concluded, and the trial is yet to happen. A lot of things were to happen. At that point in time, the judge presupposed and assumed that, that whole role for himself and thought that this may be a solution that he can offer. Okay, that's we have to just be clear that this is what happened. Coming to a general question about are victims called are their opinions taken? The criminal law doesn't work like that. Sentencing cannot work on the opinion of the complainant or the prosecutors or the victim. It doesn't work like that. We may want it to work like that, but it doesn't work like that. A criminal law jurisprudence works where they look at the evidence, they look at the law, and they look at the manner in which the sentence can be imposed on this person, and that's how they send to sentences.
I think your screen froze.
Presented to the judge. So in that case, it's not something like a civil suit where we can meet someplace and go and tell somebody that, okay, this is the judgment that I would like to do. It's not a civil suit where I can go and claim that is my right.
Okay.
Having said that, there's jurisprudence about what is victim impact and what is the impact that is happening to her is developing. And there are places where victims are actually called and allowed to make a statement to the judge, to explain to the judge about what is it that they have gone through. But it is not something that is kind of universally applicable or universally applied in our jurisprudence yet. They do look at it. In many cases, we as private lawyers who represent victims do try to bring it up. We do try to influence the judge by by indicating to them, this is what the trauma she's happened, this is what has happened to her. And this is the violence that she suffered. This is the impact that this violence has had on her. So you should consider that before you actually decide on a sentence. That is something we try to do. But this is not a hard and fast rule that takes place.
But when you were talking about how a judge in this particular case presupposed a situation and gave this the remarks that have been challenged now. Does such an order have a bearing on the end investigation? Like, when such a thing happens that, the accused visits the house of the victim, ties a rakhi, and, gives money to her as a sign of ritual, etc. Does this entire thing, has a bearing on the end investigation? Does it hamper the real investigation of sexual assault case that is at stake here?
It would, isn't it? It's kind of, I mean, it's your guess as much as mine, because if the perpetrator and the victim are allowed to engage with each other, you can only imagine the outcome. And I mean, as Rama said in the beginning, to a large extent, what we invariably see is that a lot of women, and all of us put together here, do not want to go through that hostile criminal justice process. It's extremely hostile. A lot of us do not want to go through that. So if we are offered these kind of sweeteners and say that, okay, take this, you're happy, and many of us are likely to take it. But that's exactly what we are fighting against. We do not want those sweeteners offered to us. We are fighting for something. We are violated, right? As women, we are violated. So we are violated, and it's a crime committed on us. We don't want to just accept something like this and say that, okay, this is fine, we'll go on. So this is what we are fighting against at this point in time. At this stage, it is not proper at all for any of us to comment on what can happen in this case. But it's anyone's guess. It's anyone's guess.
I'm Advocate Rama. I'm just, I think, a few minutes more before we close the discussion. My question to you is, just taking a cue from what Advocate Bhatt said, how far do you think this evidentiary process proves to be troublesome for a sexual assault victim in the court of law? Is this why a lot of complaints are not made and brushed, aside the carpets, or, how do you see this entire evidentiary process panning out in the court of law when we deal with such specific cases?
In many cases, we don't find that, the woman will not have enough evidence, because criminal law jurisprudence, it rests on the surmise that the accused should be proved beyond reasonable doubt to have committed the crime. So it becomes difficult for the woman to always have all the evidence or witnesses. Witnesses can go hostile at any moment, so it is very difficult for a woman to prove, especially if the trial is prolonged. The also gets diminished, one, and secondly, the witnesses also may not be there. One, we have seen that many witnesses are not alive even, or are not within the jurisdiction or able to come and depose. Also, we see that many a times the woman does not have enough evidence. Like, there may not be anybody around to have been witness to what she has gone through. Right. So evidentiary, it becomes very difficult for her. And in those cases, it becomes more difficult for her to depose in the hostile environment of a criminal court, which dissuades many women from coming forward and complaining unless it is really serious.
Yeah, but probably that's the reason why in the last couple of weeks only, there have been so many reports of, sexual assault victims turning hostile in the court of law or dropping charges. I think that brings us to the end of the discussion today. I thank each one of you for your precious time to be here with us at Bar and Bench. I think the hearing is slated for this Friday. So, we obviously cannot speak about the hearing, which is set to happen, but I hope the end objective of the petitioners are certainly met. That is, the rights of the sexual assault victims and not being objectified by the courts of law. I thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and I close the session. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon.